All right, looks like everybody's getting logged in, so we'll go ahead and kick things off here. Welcome to our webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. We are here today to chat a little bit about headless architecture, headless CMSs, and why you should go headless now with Gatsby and Contentful. So before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping items for everybody who's joining today. So first things first, this webinar is being recorded, which is great if you're kind of late getting to the webinar because you're logging into Zoom and things like that. The webinar is going to be recorded. It takes a few days to receive a link. We process the video and add captions to it and things like that. So be on the lookout after today's session for a link to this recording as it becomes available. The other thing I'll point out is please feel welcome to ask questions in the Q&A tab here in Zoom, and we will do our best to either respond to them via text or we'll respond to them directly in the webinar here. So with that in mind, let's introduce ourselves really quick. I'll go ahead and go first. My name is Alan Smith. I'm a senior product marketing manager here at Gatsby, and I'm joined here by my colleague, David. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, thanks, Alan. I'm David Fotse. I'm a senior software engineer over at Contentful, and I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between the DevRel team and the extensibility team that helped build the apps. And I'm really excited to talk about the Contentful Gatsby integration here today.
Yeah, so am I. We got a jam-packed session today, y'all. We're going to start off with a bit of a trip back through the history of web development. We're going to get a little bit nerdy here, right? So we're going to look at what led up to the monolithic CMS. And then we're going to talk about some big shifts that have occurred in web development over the past several years. And then we're going to switch gears and we're going to show you how Gatsby and Contentful work together with your other systems to help you break out of that monolith and use composable architecture to build modern, performant websites for your business and for your customers. So let's dive in. Let's start way back, right? Let's talk about the history of the monolith, right? So if you remember, and I remember, before 2000, website development was, it was hard. Like it was a bit of a challenge, right? But we did have a relatively simple setup by today's standards, right? If you wanted to build a web page, your content, you'd probably have to type it up manually. You'd have to code that HTML by hand, but that content was served from file systems, right? We had limited support for dynamic content. We had CGI scripts and server-side includes and things like that. But generally speaking, everything was pretty static. The workflow was that you would create and maintain that static HTML yourself. You'd copy that content to a directory on a web server, typically by FTP, and it was just served to people. So now while all of this is happening in the mid to late 90s, starting around the mid 90s, we start to see some new open source technology emerging, really gaining traction. And these are tools like, let's say, the Linux operating system. These are tools we've all heard of, right? The Apache web server, the MySQL database management system, and the PHP scripting language. So this is that LAMP stack that we often refer to. And this gives way to the next era in web development. Content management, in a lot of ways, goes mainstream, right? We say it's the WordPress revolution, but the revolution didn't really start with WordPress. There are a lot of stepping stones along the way. We had tools like Movable Type and Blogger. If you remember Blogger before Google purchased them, I think. There was LiveJournal and Zanga. There were all sorts of services where people could create content using forms, basically. You're interacting with an application, basically, to edit and maintain content. We call it the WordPress revolution, though, because WordPress really marked a critical tipping point that put the power of content publishing in people's hands like never before, right? They could create and store and edit content because WordPress combined some very powerful tools into a singular experience that provided things like dynamic content rendering, all of these things that we didn't have before that we now have automatically using this monolithic model. So sounds great, right? But during this time, just like before, we see some other powerful tools and tech emerging in the open source world that begin to take hold, and they start to change things as well. So we think about tools like Git, which was released in 2005. It made it easier for people all around the world to write code together without centralized coordination. And because of that, we have this huge proliferation of open source web frameworks too, things like Django and Ruby on Rails and Symfony and Cake PHP, if that's your thing. These tools made it easier for people to build web applications, to build very advanced websites that did things more than just serving static content. And don't forget, in 2007, we had a huge shift when the iPhone was released, because for the first time, people had a first-class web browser on their mobile phones, and developers had to start thinking about how to create websites that served people on desktop computers and people who are on mobile phones. I'll also call out in 2009, it's really important because Node.js came out, which marked the departure from the web browser for JavaScript. JavaScript isn't just a tool for showing alerts on a web page anymore. This is a very powerful tool that can exist on the server. These are all things that are happening while this WordPress revolution is happening. Now, around this time, the monolithic CMS was evolving as well. It's becoming bigger and it's grafting on functionality, trying to do just about anything and everything imaginable. Meanwhile, this explosion of new tech tools that we have, it makes it easier to just build all of the things yourself, right? We have rich user interfaces and interactivity that's powered by third-party libraries for CSS and JavaScript. Thanks to things like, NPM and Ruby gems and pip, we have software modules for just about anything and everything. And it's around this time that you're not really creating just a website to be consumed anymore. The idea is that you're building a piece of software. In 2011, which was in this same realm right here, Mark Andreessen, who's one of the original Mozilla people, he had this great quote in the Wall Street Journal. He said, "Software is eating the world," right? And what he meant by that is that every company really essentially was becoming a software company, because you're not just building web pages, you're engineering pieces of software for people. So as this is happening, right, we see a monolithic model that's just growing and it's getting bigger and more monolithic. And we have some of these new pathways that are emerging. We start to see a divergence as the limits of the monolithic model are tested, right? There's all sorts of bloat and performance issues related to the challenges of the monolithic CMS's one-stop shop model that start to emerge, right? We have WordPress sites that have been kind of retrofitted into e-commerce stores. There's all sorts of UX challenges related to the need for responsive web design, because more and more people are engaging with your site on a mobile device. More and more people are coming online. So we have to be inclusive with the way that we design websites. We have to be thoughtful about that. And there's all sorts of new challenges that are emerging as these things happen. Now, meanwhile, we have cloud services that are built on these web frameworks like Rails, with tools like Node, things like that. This gives way to specialized tools, these best of breed kind of web apps that let you specialize. So we have things like Shopify, we have GitHub, we have analytics providers, we have specialized CMSs like Contentful, for instance. Thanks to this explosion of web apps, we have a web app for just about anything. And around this time, don't forget, we have this concept of containerization, right? Virtualization and containerization make it easier to modularize all of these new tools that are emerging and to connect them. And previously, all of these pieces had to be knit together by hand. So when we think about the three primary types of folks who a content publishing workflow serves, it's clear that this legacy monolithic model really struggles to keep everybody happy, especially when we have all of these new pathways, these new tools that are emerging. So when we talk about these three types of folks, what do we mean by that? So in my opinion here, we have three different types of people who a content publishing system is meant to serve. So we have the developer, and developers want approachable technology and they want tools that help them be productive. Then on the other side here, we have marketers or content curators, content creators. These people really value that content management workflow. They want the flexibility to be able to make changes and experiment with the website without needing to open a ticket or loop in the dev team every time they want to do something. And then on the other side, we have the visitor, right? This is who the developer and the content editor ultimately serve, right? It's people like you and me. And what do we want, right? We want websites that are performant. We want them, websites that offer a great user experience, responsiveness. Ultimately, we just want websites that make it easy to consume the content that's on them. And the one size fits all model of that monolith, it really struggles to meet everybody's needs. So what has happened is that another fundamental shift has occurred. Web development has gone from monolithic to modular. Today, if you want to build a website, you no longer have to inherit the features of your monolithic CMS. You can compose the experience that makes the most sense for your customers and for your business. I'll be honest, I'm a bit of a shameless marketer here. So I was looking at these photos the other day and I said, the photo on the right looks kind of intimidating to me, right? On the left, we have this monolith that looks very organized. It's neat. But the photo on the right, it can be intimidating to people like me. And that's where Gatsby comes in, right? Gatsby is a free open source framework for orchestrating all of the pieces over here in this image into a modern performant website. So how does it do that? And we'll dive into kind of greater detail later, but this is kind of like a surface level overview of how Gatsby works, right? There are lots of different ways to orchestrate those pieces that we saw in that modular diagram. And there's lots of tools for different approaches, but Gatsby's primary mode of rendering content is what we call static generation. And in a nutshell, what happens is that you have a build process, which is similar in principle to a software compilation process, where Gatsby fetches the most current data from external sources. It feeds that data into templates, and then it uses React to convert all of those populated templates into static web pages, kind of like the ones that we had way back in the 90s, if you can remember from the beginning of our session today. Then you take those static files and you deploy them to a CDN where they're replicated globally on edge servers, and they're delivered to people all over the world in a very efficient way. So let's dive into that content layer just a little bit closer, because to me, the content layer is what makes Gatsby, for lack of a better word, magical in a lot of ways. The content layer lets you fetch data from disparate sources using plugins, right? So you don't have to write your own solution unless you want to. Gatsby supports that as well. So maybe your team works with Contentful for their CMS, and maybe they have a Shopify store as well. Maybe some of your teams use Airtable to maybe crunch some numbers in spreadsheets and things like that. Gatsby makes it super streamlined to pull all of that data in, and it synthesizes all of that content into a singular data store where it can be queried with a standardized API. So to put that another way, you don't have to learn the nuances of a dozen different REST APIs. You can learn the GraphQL syntax that Gatsby has, and Gatsby handles all the details for you. Then once your data is sourced and your templates are populated, Gatsby transpiles that, or transmogrifies, it's one of my favorite words, transmogrifies that into a static HTML page. Now, why static? Well, to put it simply, static is fast and simple, right? The HTML is pre-rendered, which decreases the time it takes for a web browser to receive a response from the web server. This is something we often refer to as time to first byte. It's a core web vital that affects your search rankings. The other thing is that static is just an efficient way to deliver content, right? Why re-render the same HTML response for every visitor if the content rarely changes? And finally, static scales in a way that server rendering simply doesn't. You can scale a monolithic solution using database replication and load balancing, and you can increase your spend on your compute costs. Or if you're using static, you can use a CDN and you distribute that content and scale it instead of scaling your infrastructure. So it just scales in a different way. It's also worth pointing out that static is more secure, and I think we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So it's these things, speed, efficiency, and scalability, that together make static rendering a great choice in the vast majority of cases. But for anybody who's curious, I do want to point out that Gatsby in its newer versions also supports server-side rendering and deferred rendering, which you can read more about on Gatsby.js. But developers can mix and match these rendering methods on a single web page so that you can use the best rendering option for the job. But Gatsby is not just a tool for improving your website. It's also a tool for improving cross-team collaboration. Gatsby just makes it easier for content creators and developers to collaborate without blocking each other and without stepping on each other's toes. We're going to see a little bit more about this in just a few minutes as we look at how Contentful and Gatsby work together to streamline that workflow. But this is something that especially resonates with me because I know, I work in Contentful every day, and I know how challenging it can be to collaborate on something that involves code and content. And using Gatsby and Contentful together really streamlines that process. So just to recap a little bit, I've talked a ton, I know, we've gone kind of down memory lane with web development, but why would we go headless? Why would we use a composable architecture and a headless CMS? Performance is tough to beat, right? Your website's going to be faster. It's going to be optimized if you're using Gatsby. It's more secure because you have decoupled your administrative interfaces from the parts of your website that your visitors interact with. It's scalable because you don't have to deal with that infrastructure cost. You don't have to scale up a web server to serve people all around the globe. You can take advantage of a CDN and serve that static content. Flexibility is huge too, right? Because you can source content from anywhere using Gatsby, and you can take advantage of those thousands of plugins that Gatsby has to source data from anywhere and everywhere. And lastly, we'll talk about productivity more in just a bit, but it lets your developers and your content editors use the tools that they want to. Content editors can stay in your favorite headless CMS. You can stay in Contentful, and developers can stay in their IDEs if they want to. And everybody can work together without blocking each other, without stepping on each other's toes. So I'm going to pause real quick, and I'm going to hand things over to my colleague David here. And he's going to chat with us a little bit about Contentful and how Contentful fits in and how Gatsby and Contentful work together.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think what Alan went over is great, and I think we're going to dive into that a lot on the Contentful side of things. I'm going to actually end up sharing my screen as well here. If you don't mind switching off here.
That sounds good. Yeah, I'll stop my share and you go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm just going to run through a few talking points, and then we're going to do a short demo to understand, what is Contentful and how it works. So getting started, what is Contentful? I think in short, it's a customizable API-first content management system. It's going to offer all of the modern cutting-edge features that we come to expect from products in 2022. So it's got cloud infrastructure. It has an API that's really developer-friendly. And of course, the great thing about Contentful here is as you construct the content types inside of Contentful, you actually are crafting your API responses as well. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, we have apps as well, which, you can think of those as extensions or plugins, but they allow these third-party platforms to come in and connect with your content model. And thus you can either empower your content model, you can augment it with third-party data, or you can send that data inside of Contentful out to a third party. In this case, you could think of maybe like a translation engine or something like that, where you need this kind of cyclical approach for your data to go in, become translated, and come back into Contentful. We'll look at a few examples of that in a little bit. So first things first, I talked about structured content, and I've mentioned this term content model. I think in developer terms, we can really think about this as a data model or just simply classes inside of a programming language. In this case, if we were to create just let's say we're creating a simple blog website, you can imagine that you're going to have a post class, an author class, maybe a roles class. different kinds of classes. And these are, this is your data model. In Contentful, it's called the content model. And what this allows you to do is easily pick all of the different values you want for these different content types. So you can see here we have a plethora of selections, and they're all the things that you'd come to expect from building out a content model. So you can include rich text, you can have normal text, numbers, dates, locations. And of course, for more advanced features, you can have plain raw JSON objects, as well as references. So references would be kind of like class inheritances or classes that reference other classes. When you come into the code, it really kind of pans out very well because all of these different content types or the data model can correspond to, say, React components or UI components. So it's really easy to map, the data coming from Contentful into your UI layer and have that render out every time in a predictable way. And so you can easily build your UIs in that sense. Now, Contentful is really just a content factory. And so as a developer, you would definitely define your content model. And then you would have non-developers, either authors or people that are writing the content, put that content into Contentful in the way that you specify. And because you create these content models, you're going to be getting that same content model structure coming over on the API calls. So this is kind of what I mean by the fact that you really get to create the APIs yourself. You can structure exactly what's going to be coming back, and you can either include or exclude data that you want. So we have a couple different APIs from Contentful, and they do offer almost all the same features. However, their use cases are slightly different. So first and foremost, we have what we call the CDA, and this is just an acronym for the Content Delivery API. This is a read API where all of your published content is going to show up over the wire. And when I say published content, I mean content that is not in draft, it's not in archive, it's not, changed or anything like that. This is content that's published and it's ready to go to production. So the CDA is really for grabbing all of your production content and showing that on your production software. Now the CPA, the Content Preview API, is pretty much the same as the CDA, except the CPA does port in data that is in preview mode or that data that has been changed or anything like that. So the CPA is great for your lower environment projects where you're doing a QA session or you're sending work through a pipeline that needs review before it goes to prod. So that's what you'd use the CPA for. And then we have the CMA, which really unlocks a lot of power for developers that want to programmatically access Contentful. The content management API can read and write to Contentful, which means that you can pull data from Contentful. You can do any kind of third-party manipulation to it. So if you want to run your data through a Lambda function or through a translation service or through an A/B test or anything like that, that's what the CMA is for. You bring it through. You do the data manipulation on it, and then you can write it back into Contentful in the way that you need it to be written back. Excuse me. And then, of course, we also offer assets, so you can upload images and videos into your space. And on top of that, we offer the GraphQL API, which, sorry about that, which connects to the CDA and the CPA. And so if you're familiar with using GraphQL, and of course, if you're running a Gatsby project, you're most likely going to use GraphQL, and we'll look at that example in a second. But that also connects to both the CDA and the CPA, so you can really fine tune the content that you want to come across the wire. And then last but not least, we also offer a sync API, which is a nice feature for people that are concerned about network usage. The sync API allows you to read data from Contentful and kind of find the difference in data where things have changed. Now, the sync API is probably not used as often. It's just used for people that are on low network connections or anything like that, where you may not want to grab a full payload response, but instead just try to find things that have been changed. So moving on, I did talk about apps inside of Contentful, and one of the apps we offer is, of course, the Gatsby app, which we will look at in a live preview. But the Gatsby app is great because it helps you connect the current content that you're working on onto your Gatsby live preview. And so you'll be able to deep link into your information and into your software and products via this Gatsby link. Now, another app we have, and just to kind of illustrate a point, is in this case, we've got a Shopify app, which is showing up inside of the default Contentful interface. So if we've installed the Shopify app, we actually have access to our third-party Shopify service, which allows us to input data directly from Shopify. So this kind of eliminates the need for editors to cross-reference different services and manually re-input data. So in this case, I can have the app open. I can open up a product dialog here, and I can pick products from my Shopify store. And then those products are going to get saved into Contentful. I'm going to have the name of the product, the image, the SKU, and different kinds of metadata like that. So that's really where apps are coming in, and they're highly effective. And it does help you kind of take all of these third-party integrations and kind of get that single look and feel inside of Contentful, so your editors get that seamless flow as they move through the data model. And then here, I just want to kind of recap what Alan was talking about previously. I know this is kind of a big chart, but let's start at the bottom and work our way up. So first things first, we've got the back end, and this is kind of where all of the data is going to be collated. So in this case, you have Contentful as your kind of source of truth. This is where all of your static information is going to live. And then you've got your build process, which is Gatsby, which is going to read from Contentful, most likely using the CDA or the CPA if you're in a preview environment. And on top of that, both Gatsby and Contentful are going to connect to your third-party services, such as the Shopify app. And they're going to pull all of the content in from Contentful and Shopify, and Gatsby is then going to build out your static bundle. Once your static bundle is built out, we're going to move on to the next layer of this chart here on the front end, where you're going to actually host your static bundle. So in this case, we're going to host it on Gatsby Cloud or something like that. And then moving up again on the delivery layer, we will probably put a CDN in front of our hosted service. That way, as clients connect and request data, they can hit CDNs, which are geolocated closer to their locations. That way they get content faster. And of course, because a lot of the content is already statically generated, it's highly cacheable. So if we can create keys or any kind of unique identifier, we can have clients request the content through the CDN, and the CDN can quickly deliver the content that's already been rendered to the clients without having to go all the way back down the chain and requesting content from the source and having it be re-rendered from, a server or anything like that. Again, like Alan mentioned, we did in the old days. So in this model, we can have really fast connections to the client, and both Contentful and Gatsby and other services that offer CDNs allow you to really quickly have that client to software interaction. So I talked a lot about, how Contentful is kind of this content management system that allows you to produce your data and get it out to the different channels that you need. And now I just kind of want to go into a quick demo to demonstrate, how I've got a Gatsby site up and running, how I've got it connected to Contentful, and then using Gatsby Cloud, I can preview the content that I'm working on and get started working on other things. So over here in my browser, I just want to point out that I'm on gatsbyjs.com/solution/contentful. And there's multiple ways to get to the Contentful resources on the Gatsby page. There's plenty of documentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just take a look at the view docs of this page. And it's going to walk me through a bunch of things that I'm going to need. And of course, I'm going to kind of glaze over some of these things just for the sake of time. But if you follow these guides, it's really just a 10-minute setup to get Gatsby up and running with your Contentful instance. So here I'm going to just quickly gloss over, but what it's asking me to do is set up a Contentful space and then install the Gatsby source Contentful plugin into my Gatsby project. So just to demonstrate that, I do have a Gatsby blog here set up, where I do have a first post and a second post. So I've already kind of created the content model here in my Gatsby blog. And just to kind of show what that looks like here, I've got, some information. I have a title of my post. I've got a URL for slugs. And then I also have content here, which is going to be the blog post itself. And then just a little bit of metadata, which we may or may not use in the future. Now, the other thing Gatsby is asking from me is to actually include in the plugin my space ID and my API key. So over in the Contentful UI, I'm just going to go to my space settings. I'm going to head on down to API keys. And I've just created a new API key. It's just a simple couple of button presses, and we'll auto-generate an API key here. And you can see it's giving me my space ID, and it's giving me my content delivery API key, which is the one we'll use for today. So let's, before I move on, let's just jump into the code and take a look at what I've got going on in the code. So over in my browser here, I do have a new Gatsby default starter project spun up. I simply ran the npm command that's on Gatsby's main website, and it generated this entire project. And if I open up the package.json file here, you can see I've got a couple scripts. I've got a build script, a develop script, a start script. So we're going to be using the start script today to just do some local development. And one other thing I want to note here, and this is something that you will have gone through if you followed the instructions. I went into the Gatsby configuration module here, and I simply added in our Gatsby Contentful source plugin along with my space ID and my access token. So I'm pretty much set up to actually get Contentful data over from Contentful and get it into my Gatsby site. So the way I'm doing that, if I open my source directory and I go into pages and I go into the index page, you can see I've kind of set up a custom index page here. So I took what we had from the Gatsby starter, and I just added in a quick GraphQL query to query my Contentful space and get the date, slug, and title field of my posts. Now, again, going back into Contentful here, just to reiterate, if I go into first posts, that's talking about the title field here, the slug, and the date field I've got down here. So I'm just grabbing these three fields from my Contentful posts. And then back in the code, we can see here we've got some hard-coded React components, which are just showing a bit of the page. And then down here in the Contentful query, I've got data coming in, and I'm mapping over that data and creating links to those posts. Now that's just looking at the code. Let's see what this looks like kind of in real life here. So I'm going to just head over, make sure I've got my local build running. I do. So I ran npm run start, and that runs this quick script here, which then tells me that my starter is running on localhost 8000. So let's open up localhost 8000. And you can see I've got my Gatsby starter running here on my local machine. And just to kind of prove it, let's change the title. You can see it says hi people here. Let's go in and just change this to hi folks. And if I hit save, we should have that live updating happening here. So I'm definitely in a preview mode, and I'm definitely on my developer environment. And I've got the ability to now start working on my templating engine. I can change this to do whatever I want. And of course, down here where I was iterating over my posts, you can see I've got my first post and my second post, and I've actually got them linked into my Gatsby site. So if I actually click on this, you can see the slug here is being used to generate the URL. And I've got the content from my post coming in. So this is my first post, and this is more content. So let's just take a quick look. Yep, exactly. This is exactly what's coming from Contentful. So I've got that set up, and this takes, about 10 minutes just following the directions. I can get information up and running onto a Gatsby site. And then, of course, from there, I can, develop this to my heart's content. I can fulfill all my business logic and things like that. Now that I have data flowing from Contentful into Gatsby, I would just now work on my templating engine. Now, another cool thing to note here is when you do run a new Gatsby project, if you deploy a starter project, that's going to set you up with either a GitHub repo or a different, maybe a Bitbucket repo, depending on the product you're using. But you will be set up with a repo, and that's going to connect to a Gatsby Cloud instance if you'd like. And so what I've done here is I've actually set up a Gatsby Cloud instance for this same exact project. And so now when I commit and push to, when I commit to master, and then I push that up to my GitHub origin, it's going to start triggering builds every time it sees that in GitHub I have a new commit. And it's going to trigger these builds. And also Gatsby Cloud is nice enough to give me a custom website here where I can preview it live. So this is actually on the live internet. So I can send this link out to stakeholders or my manager or anyone, you know, that I'm working with and say like, hey, here's the latest features on our Gatsby build. You can see the preview here. So that's a great feature. And then of course, one last thing, if I want to, I can install the Gatsby app here in Contentful. And as I work specifically on these posts, I can tell Contentful how to deep link specifically into my preview site and then show me these posts specifically. So if I hit this big purple button here to preview my post, you can see not only am I going into my live site, but it's deep linking me right into my first post content here. So this is really great for editors as they're working on a preview environment, for example. They can make some changes and then they can hit the Gatsby button and they can check out those changes live. And then of course I can take this URL and copy and paste it to stakeholders and have that in front of people right away. So that workflow is really great, especially if I'm doing, you know, a proof of concept or something like that. I can get started in minutes and have something going. And then of course, this all scales out into extremely large projects over time. So I think with that, I've covered everything on the Contentful Gatsby side of things. I just want to reiterate that Contentful does come with a lot of cool features that really help you kickstart your Gatsby experience. So we do have the marketplace, the app marketplace, which has a bunch of different app integrations. And people are building new integrations all the time. So that's always updating and we're always getting new apps all the time there. We also offer our Forma 36 design system, which allows you to build apps inside of Contentful that have the Contentful look and feel. So if you do want to build a custom app, or let's say you want to improve upon the Gatsby app, or even create a custom app that integrates Gatsby and Contentful inside of Contentful, you can use Forma 36 to quickly build those so you don't need to get the design team involved. And then we also include a bunch of open source tooling, again, Gatsby being one of them, where you can quickly connect your instances together. And again, just to reiterate, we've got that Gatsby source Contentful plugin, and that's what I used today. You can find that on NPM or on Gatsby's site to get that up and running for your website. And just to kind of practice what we preach here, I'm just showing that contentful.com actually uses Gatsby as well. And we've basically followed the same workflow, although of course, contentful.com is a fairly complex marketing website and it connects with a lot of different third-party services. But under the hood, we're using good old Contentful and Gatsby integration to just ensure that our site is launched as fast as possible and it, you know, loads as fast as possible for people all around the world. And if you're interested in any more content about Contentful or the Gatsby integration, you of course can visit contentful.com/developers. That's a resource to all of our developer stuff, Contentful specific developer stuff. And then you can also, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us on Slack at contentful.com/Slack. We have a public Slack instance where we have a lot of community members that share a lot of projects they've worked on and they answer a lot of questions. And of course, people ask a lot of questions. So we have a good communication there as well. And I think with that, I'm going to invite Alan back and we can start taking some questions, I think, from the audience.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a bunch, David. That was really helpful, kind of seeing how everything works together, especially just how the architecture is laid out. That was a huge help. We've had a few questions come in. I've answered a few in the Q&A window. One that a couple of people have asked so far is how you would handle in a headless / static architecture. How would you handle dynamic and personalized content, like something that might come in on an e-commerce site? And the answer to that is the server-side rendering that Gatsby offers. I didn't have a chance to dive into detail about that, but it's another rendering strategy that Gatsby offers. And basically what it does is it lets you generate your static content and also query data from external systems at runtime and combine those on your page. So you can mix and match it basically. So you have static rendering and you have server-side rendering. We also have a third type of rendering, which is called deferred static rendering or deferred static generation, which is just another option for choosing when content should be rendered or built.
Yeah, and just on a technicality there, that is actually, I was using the deferred static rendering there when I was showing the individual pages of my blog post. So that is kind of an example of that.
Oh, perfect. Cool. Let's see if we have any other questions here. All right. Oh, we've had a lot of questions come in. So let's see here. Somebody else asked if the model we're showcasing here is like combining a headless CMS with a Jamstack option. I think that's a fair way of putting it. Yep. This is basically combining a headless CMS, which is one piece of a composable architecture. Basically, Gatsby is something that helps wrangle all of those pieces and generate websites, web pages from that. Let's see here. I believe this one we have answered. So personalized content, I think that comes back to static rendering versus server-side rendering. And I'm just checking these off here. One question here, does the preview deep linking work for paths that are customized via create page? I would have to double check to confirm, but I believe it does. I think the question here is around the CMS integration piece. So when you click the preview button, does that link you directly to a dynamically generated page? And in my experience, it does, but I would have to double check to confirm. You can check the docs on, the Gatsby Cloud docs should have a clear answer on that.
I think just to note on that as well. So I guess it depends on what you mean or on how you're dynamically generating those URLs. But for example, in the example I gave, I think you can technically think of those URLs as being dynamically generated as well, because I'm not hard coding in my blog posts. I'm using that slug field inside of Contentful to actually get the preview URL. So if you're doing something similar, if you actually kind of know what the URL structure is going to be, let's say it's like a date, like if you're using a blog, it's usually like a date and then slash the blog title. At least in Contentful, when you're running that preview, the Gatsby preview button, you can configure it to look at different fields inside of Contentful, and then you can use like kind of a string, a template string to say like, here's how the slug is going to look, the final slug.
Yep. So another question that came in, somebody asked, generally, what's a good number of months to plan? I'm assuming the question is, how long does it take to plan a transition to a headless CMS to a headless architecture? I think it depends. It depends on what you're currently using. It depends on what your setup is. You can do it quickly with a small website, but if you have a very complex website, it could take a little bit longer. I would encourage you to chat with, I know at Gatsby here, we have, for enterprise customers, we have Gatsby Concierge, and they come in and they help you kind of plan your migration to whatever headless CMS you'd like to use. If you want to transition over to Contentful and you want to have a Gatsby setup, we can sort of help you through that. We have experts who have done this a ton, and they can help you plan that out. Two more questions about data sourcing. One is how to use GraphQL as a data source. Another one is Dataverse. I would encourage you to take a look at the plugin library that's on gatsbyjs.com. I don't know right offhand, if these two specific ones have dedicated plugins for them. One that I can call out, I know that WordPress, if you're integrating with WordPress, and even Contentful has a GraphQL API. Is that right, David? Yep. So, and that functions kind of the same way. You're querying a GraphQL API. So you may want to take a look at the source code for that plugin, the Contentful source plugin for Gatsby, is because it hits the Contentful GraphQL API. Is that right?
Yeah, so yeah, if you're using Contentful, you will get that out of the box, and it should be really easy to set up. One thing I didn't go over but is available is you also will get that GraphQL, the iGraph previewer, so you can kind of in a UI you can see what you've got available to you in GraphQL, and you can build out queries using that UI, which is really nice because it's a lot easier to craft your queries, and it's less trial and error basically.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference, being able to see what all data you have available. All right, let's see here. Other questions using Contentful. I wonder how one can manage environments. So I know I can't speak to Contentful specifically. David may have a more, just a better answer on that side. I know that Gatsby automatically, if you use Gatsby Cloud, you have automatic preview environments for your production, your pull requests, and your CMS updates. We handle all of those preview environments for you. But David, I believe y'all have two different, I saw the two different APIs in there. Is that right?
Right. So I can actually give an example using contentful.com's marketing website. We follow the strategy that Alan just mentioned, which is our production site uses the content delivery system. So that's all for prod data. And then anytime we're making updates to that marketing website, we submit pull requests in GitHub, and that's automatically linked with Gatsby Cloud Previews. So it generates a brand new URL for that specific pull request, and it uses the content preview API. So you can see data that's maybe not yet ready for production, but it's got the new code that's working on the marketing website, and it has data that's not yet published. So that's kind of how we QA and do all of our checks before we publish to production.
Oh, that's a great example. Let's see here. So here's a big question, right? So for content editors, people who are working on creating and managing this content, what's the biggest changes? What are the biggest challenges they experience moving from, say, monolithic to a headless architecture or a headless CMS? David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think probably that ties in with the migration question. Obviously, you're trying to get your data into a different system so you can start working with it. At Contentful, we do offer migration solutions. So we have a whole bunch of pre-built scripts, and we've got migration tools specifically made for this problem. It does depend on the current CMS that you're using, because you will need to extract the data from that CMS. So if they do allow you to programmatically extract it, that's perfect. If you can get it into some kind of JSON or even XML response, then you're golden, because then our migration tools will then distribute it. You just have to define what the data looks like in the content model in Contentful. That being said, if your data is kind of in different places, it does get a little harder. But again, you can use those same migration scripts as long as you've got kind of a service or a script that can collate the data you need into a single point and then run the Contentful migration scripts to get everything into a Contentful instance. You should be good to go. You won't have to do any kind of long hours of manually inputting and copy and pasting and things like that.
Right. Let me just see a quick note here. I think Aaron had asked us a question. Yep. Our colleague Aaron, who's here with us, he mentioned it might be worth touching a little bit on what we mean by headless and what that means from a workflow perspective for those content folks. And this kind of touches on another question that was asked in our Q&A window as well. Really, to me, one of the biggest shifts is kind of thinking about content editing as being decoupled from the front end. I'm coming from like a very monolithic background, like WordPress, right? I think is the classic example here. You're editing content in the same kind of environment, the same application, really, where you're seeing your changes made. When you go headless, those two pieces are separate because the headless CMS doesn't have that front end on it. And so users who are editing that content A lot of times I think there's a challenge with kind of like mental mapping, right? Because your site, your changes have to be built instead of just being rendered at runtime. So that I think is a little bit of a challenge for them as well. But when previewing content, I should say. But that's kind of it in a nutshell, I think. I hope that answers that question. All right. Another question, can Gatsby work with headless CMS and headless commerce platforms apart from Shopify? Yes. I would encourage you to take a look at all of the different plugins available, all the different integrations we have with different e-commerce solutions, especially. I think there's maybe a handful for things like WooCommerce. They all operate a little bit differently, so see what meets your needs. But take a look at that plugin directory to see what all types of systems that you can have a Gatsby site work with. All right. So another question here. What if your content team is not a traditional content team like that in a big company, right? So let's see. For example, a primary static site that gets content from multiple non-technical content providers, say like teachers from different institutions. Do those users log into Contentful to post their content, such as a blog post, or do they use Gatsby to develop the admin interface? So I think it's about that editor experience is what I'm getting from this question here. Yeah.
I think there are some non-standard uses of Contentful. Contentful can be thought of as just a data store. So there are use cases where people are putting data into Contentful and they're not, running a website per se with it, or they're not running a public website. I think, depending on your use case, let's say you're doing some kind of an internal project where you need to gather data from, let's say, stakeholders or employees or something, and then you need to post that internally, maybe into an intranet instead of the internet or something like that. This still works perfectly fine, because at the end of the day, what you're going to do is you're going to have Contentful be like kind of your data input engine there. And then Gatsby can still build you kind of this internal website that you're only going to post onto your internal network to either show results or show, different things. So I think in that case, that's really, that can be used in that sense. And then even on top of that, if you don't want to necessarily give people access to Contentful to mess around with the entire data model, because we offer the content management API, the one that can be written to, you're also welcome to build your own editor experience and then have that talk to a backend service that uses the content management API to then officially save the data into Contentful. So in that case, you'd kind of be using Contentful as your database in that sense. So there's a bunch of different options there. It just depends on, I guess, what your use case is.
I was just thinking through this use case here too. And I think that in higher education, like a solution like Contentful would be really helpful because you can centralize the management of all of that content. If you think about, like, I live in North Carolina and we have all these like satellite campuses everywhere. And so you can centralize the management of all that content, and you could use Gatsby to make sure you have consistency across all of the different websites. And that's where Headless really shines, I think, because you have centralized management and you can use that content in, whatever way you can imagine, basically. Yep. Mark this as question or as answered. Oh, we have a few more that have come in. I want to check our time real quick. We're about 5 minutes before the top of the hour. So the question here is, similar to using WordPress engine, WP engine, is there a way to copy environments with just a click, database structure, contents, etc.? I think there's two sides to this because we are decoupled. David, there'd probably be the CMS side in terms of replicating maybe a data modeling schema. And then on the Gatsby side, it would be maybe replicating a site that has been built for a particular preview. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, I think, again, that's going to tie into the migration scripts that I talked about earlier. So you're going to extract data. In this case, if it's WordPress, you're going to be extracting those WordPress entries out and then using the migration scripts, which use the CMA, the content management API, to then write that data to Contentful. And then, yeah, I think for, if you've got a website on WordPress, you will have to do the templating engine inside of Gatsby, seems like.
Yep, that's right. And, on the rendered side, like once your site is built, with Gatsby, builds are atomic. So you could literally copy the directory of your built site to somewhere else, and that would be in that other place. I think the question was probably more geared toward what David was answering, but just in case it wasn't. All right. Oh, it looks like we answered this one already, the CMS API. Yep. Okay, cool. So that is all the questions that I see in our Q&A window. One that came in right here at the end. David, do you know if that repository you created for today's presentation, is that public or is that private?
The repository I created is just a private one, but I would say there's nothing very different in there than just going and reading that documentation and running it yourself. I just won't be publishing it publicly just because I've got my API keys in there. So I'm not going to be showing that publicly, but I'm really at the kind of baseline bare minimum. So you will be able to get kind of to where I got today, like I said, within like about 10-20 minutes of just following through on the instructions.
Yep. And the other thing too, I think, David, Contentful and Gatsby both have really great starter projects available through their websites, through our respective websites, that show you exactly how these systems can work together. So if people are really interested in kind of kicking the tires, I'd recommend taking a look at those because they're super easy to spin up, and you can see how things work together and really get the experience of what it feels like. All right, so I think that's all of our questions, and we're just about at the top of the hour. We'll put our contact info back up here. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alan. You can reach me most places online. My handle is Lauren Allen Smith, most places. And David, thank you so much for coming in and joining us. This has been so much fun. I've learned a ton. I'm kind of walking through everything with you about how Contentful works and about how everything fits together. It's just really fascinating how the web has changed and how it continues to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me too.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Be on the lookout for that webinar recording coming out soon.